Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 19. In this week's episode, we're talking all about the in-between, the numbness that we experience in the time between realizing our trauma and starting to heal, starting to implement those more positive behaviors that we have taught ourselves after realizing that maybe the behavior we grew up witnessing and maybe even mimicking in our adult life wasn't all that healthy. Before we get into this week's episode, I just want to take a quick minute to thank everyone who's been tuning in and following along. If you've been enjoying these episodes, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and if you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. That being said, let's dive into this week's topic. One of the things that I think narcissistic parents fail to realize is when they have a child, right, they are born with their own personality. There is already an individual, independent person there with their own characteristics and traits that will develop throughout their life. And yet so often, I think it's common for narcissistic parents to try in some way or another to mold or shape their child into a different version than themselves, whether it's a more idealized version of them that might help the narcissist to maintain and portray this image that they have worked so hard to uphold of themselves and their family to other people, whether it's just a slightly different version of the child that can better serve the narcissistic parent. Whatever it might be, I think there's this common misunderstanding amongst a lot of narcissistic parents that their child, because he or she is their child, is an extension of them rather than their own individual autonomous being with their own personality and characteristics. They're going to have certain likes and dislikes and interests that evolve and grow throughout their lives that are completely separate from your own, or maybe what you had envisioned for them. But in my opinion, the main responsibility of a parent is to support their child or children. And part of that is recognizing that their children are not extensions of them. They are their own people. And I think it's important for parents to be really present when a child is starting to figure out who they are, to develop a sense of self and identity, to help them to develop that self-trust, to be in touch with their emotions and understand how to handle them and how to communicate them to others. And yet so often, so many of these really crucial sort of developmental milestones that so many of us should have encountered when we were children get put off or brushed under the rug, or maybe just go completely by unnoticed by narcissistic parents because the nature of narcissism is so self-centered. They are so self-absorbed that they are thinking more often than not, how can you serve me instead of how can I as a parent serve you and help you to become a little person and then an adult? And I think all of this is compounded by a lot of the manipulative tactics that narcissists use so often. When you're younger, I feel like that is typically the time when you're a bit more experimental. You're encountering things, different situations, emotions, or experiences for the first time. And so you're able to ask yourself and be a little reflective. How did I like this? How did I like that? Is this for me or not? Do I want to try this thing or am I too scared? Why am I scared? There's a lot of focus on yourself, I think, when you're younger, just because of the number of experiences that you are encountering for the first time. And I think that's completely natural. And yet, when you are raised by a narcissistic parent, so many of your experiences are not self-centered. And what I mean by that, not self-centered in a negative way, more so you're not asking yourself those questions. You're not reflecting on your own behavior, on your own emotions. And the reason for that is because of things like hypervigilance, people-pleasing tendencies, parentification, all of these terms that go hand in hand with being raised by a narcissistic parent that ultimately shift the focus off of yourself, even at a young age, and onto someone else, who in these situations happens to be an adult. But when you grow up in a toxic environment like that, there isn't often space for you to ask yourself those questions because you've been conditioned over time to believe that the right thing for you to do is to be always aware of everything that's going on, to understand how everything that you say and do affects other people, and to always only prioritize someone or something else over yourself. Putting yourself first, or being in touch with your emotions, listening to the signs that your body is trying to communicate to you, is somehow selfish. And this happens so gradually and so subtly, I think, because of the nature of the relationship between a parent and a child, especially when you're talking so young. Imagine you're born into that kind of environment, being raised by a narcissistic parent. This kind of behavior is all that you will have been exposed to up until maybe your teenage years or even adulthood, depending on your situation. So you grow up thinking that, okay, if I say something that feels really true to me, but it upsets my parent, right? It's better for me to suppress what I truly feel and to take on their opinions as my own. Because when I do that, that's when I get that positive reinforcement. When I voice my true opinion, if that's something that my parent doesn't like, they're going to withhold and withdraw their affection and support and attention. And as a kid, as a young kid especially, that doesn't feel good. And we don't yet have the emotional tools to understand why our parent is doing that. We learn through behavior, and all we know at that time is that being on the receiving end of that behavior doesn't sound good. And so there's a lot of people-pleasing tendencies, there's a lot of hypervigilance, parentification, all of these things that kind of develop as a result of being raised in the environment that you were raised in. And so often, I think we develop these strategies, I guess, or these personality traits out of survival, almost self-preservation, because we're picking up on the behavior around us and we're aware of how everything that we say and do affects this really important person in our life, right? Our parent. And so that, moving forward, I think when you are exposed to that kind of behavior so regularly for such an extended period of time, it really does start to feel like you're normal. And so you don't really think to question them, maybe because you've never been exposed to anything different. You don't necessarily know that being viewed or viewing yourself as an extension of someone else is wrong or unhealthy. You don't even necessarily know that that's what's going on, that that's the position that you're in, because maybe you've never existed as an autonomous individual before if we're dealing with a parent-child relationship. And that, I think, is one of the really interesting elements of dealing specifically with narcissistic parents instead of maybe a narcissistic partner. Not that either is more bearable or less intense than the other, but I think if you're a kid coming into the world with a narcissistic parent, it can be exponentially harder to understand the behavior that you're experiencing, because there is a likelihood that you have never been exposed to an actual healthy relationship before. And so not only do you not think to question these things, but you don't even know what life outside of this control and manipulation looks or feels like. It's not for so many of us until we're in a new environment, a safe and supportive environment, or maybe we start to gain perspective, whether that's from witnessing other parent-child relationships, healthier relationship dynamics in general, that you can start to put the pieces together where you start to realize, okay, maybe the way that my family functions is not the way that everyone's family functions. Maybe the behavior, the hurtful, negative behavior that I have been on the receiving end of is not the behavior that I should expect from other people in my life. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe it's unhealthy. Maybe it's immature. Before you can start to get in touch with yourself, you have to lose touch with those projections of your narcissistic parent. And that is where a lot of it starts, with developing that self-awareness. And I think this is sort of where we get into the actual topic of this week's episode, sort of the in-between, the numbness that happens in between you realizing your trauma and actually starting to heal. And the reason that I wanted to talk about this, to do a full podcast episode on this, is because this is part of the healing journey that I don't necessarily think is very technical. I don't think it's anything that's ever been written about in depth or spoken about for that matter. It's this really strange personal experience that through developing self-awareness and really trying to be reflective of my own emotions and behavior, I've realized. And because of how difficult it was for me to experience, I felt like it was really important to talk more openly about this so that if anyone else is experiencing something similar, they understand that it's not as severe or scary or daunting as it might feel in the moment. In my experience, I can kind of recall my healing journey like a timeline. And there was a pretty significant chunk of time after breaking out of my narcissistic family that I was still sort of in autopilot. It wasn't until after I moved out that I first learned terms like gaslighting. It was sort of very tip of the iceberg. I was just starting to understand little bits about mental health, the fact that, physical and emotional needs both exist. It's not just the physical. I really didn't have a good idea of what I was dealing with or what I had dealt with up until that point. Not to mention, I had just started a business with my husband. And so I would say the first 4 years or so after moving out of my parents' house, I was very much on autopilot, focusing on something other than my mental health. And I would say within the last year, that is really when I started to heal. I started the healing journey, in my opinion. And so throughout those first 4 years, I guess the steps that I did take in healing were very gradual, and I didn't fully understand what was happening. But looking back, I have a little bit more clarity. And the way that I would explain it is through being on autopilot, right? What I was doing was just mimicking the behavior that I was exposed to, that I had picked up on throughout my childhood, and putting that to practice in my own life, in my own relationships. And that looked like defensiveness, being passive aggressive, having a hard time apologizing or taking responsibility, not communicating directly, being so hyper-focused on the needs and wants of people around me and their changes in tone or mood. I was still instinctually implementing a lot of the same behavior and reactions that I did throughout my childhood. And I think the main reason for this is what I talked about earlier. It's because that was the only real behavior that I was exposed to, that I had witnessed. And so growing up, right, when we learn through behavior, it's like, well, if this is how my parent handled this situation, that's probably the right way to handle this situation. And you're also kind of forced at times, depending on the role that you fulfill in your narcissistic family structure. Sometimes you're called upon to mimic that same behavior, maybe to back up your narcissistic parent in an argument, to provide reassurance or defense in one way or another. And so not only do you pick up on those behaviors and tendencies, maybe subconsciously from just witnessing them, but sometimes you're actually called upon to put those behaviors or ideas into practice. And so they really sort of make their way into your life and your own behavior. It kind of informs your decisions and actions moving forward. And so I was doing exactly that. I was just kind of acting whatever behavior I thought was appropriate. And it wasn't until I was able to further develop that perspective, right, that's so important by witnessing other relationships and just by being in an environment where I was no longer pressured to take on the opinions or emotions of another person. This was the first time that I was in a place where I was able to ask myself these questions. Okay, how do I feel about this, right? Does this feel good to me? Is this the kind of person that I want to be? Do I really believe what I'm arguing about right now? Is this really my side of the story? And I think it's only when you're in an environment like that that you can start to develop a level of self-awareness that is so crucial to actually start healing. And so once I would be in these situations and I would react in a way similar to my parent, right? In a way that I had experienced or witnessed growing up. There were a number of times when that experience would come and go and I felt completely justified in my reactions, in my actions, in the words that I used. But then as I got more comfortable with myself, I started to distance myself, like I said, sort of lose touch with my parents' projections. I started to feel not so great when I would display those behaviors in my personal life, in my relationships, where if there was a disagreement and I was defensive and I didn't want to apologize, maybe I didn't feel justified in that anymore. I didn't entirely feel like I was doing the right thing. I didn't feel good about it at the end of it all. And so feelings like that started to prompt me to reflect a little bit on, okay, is this really me? Is this my behavior? Is this the person that I want to be moving forward? And so when the answer to that would be no, right? I don't want to do this. I don't like the way that this feels. I don't think that I'm doing the right thing. That is sort of like the first step in unlearning a lot of those behaviors and realizing, I guess, that they are exactly that. They're learned behaviors. And, when you grow up in an environment like that, from the time you're born, it can feel like these characteristics that have maybe been assigned to you, right? Or these characteristics that you have come to take on are intrinsic to you as a person, that I'm just a defensive person, or I'm just an anxious person. It becomes part of you. And I think realizing that, okay, this actually doesn't feel good, right, leads to that realization that, okay, these are learned behaviors. These are learned opinions. I wasn't necessarily born this way. This is something that I was encouraged to take on as part of my personality because it helped to serve someone else in my life. And so having that realization that these negative behaviors that you no longer want to embody are learned is massively important, because what that means, what kind of goes off, the light that goes off in your brain there, at least for me, was if I learned these at some point in my life, I can unlearn them now, and I can teach myself better, healthier behaviors that feel true to me, that'll help me to create the kind of life that I want for myself in the future. And so that is a super important point to come to. And I think there's a certain level of perspective that's necessary for that, a certain level of self-awareness also that's necessary for that. And so that's a huge first step, but it is just the beginning. At least in my experience, it was just the beginning. I understood a little bit where this behavior was coming from. I was starting to be able to trace these behaviors back to particular experiences throughout my childhood and thinking to myself, okay, well, I feel like this. It's probably because I experienced something like this or because this happened in my life. So that makes a lot of sense. But now, this is really kind of when we get into these muddier waters. Now you approach a very similar situation. Maybe you get into an argument with your partner. Your immediate reaction, right, sort of your gut instinct, is to get defensive. But now, because you have developed that self-awareness, you refrain from doing that. But taking on and sort of teaching yourself these newer, healthier behaviors is not an easy process. And it's not something that happens quickly or without a lot of practice. And so for me, what happened in these situations is that I would say, okay, I know how I'm feeling right now. I'm very defensive. Maybe I want to be a little passive aggressive. I want to be cold and distant, right? And I don't necessarily want to apologize because it makes me very uncomfortable. But I know that even though I feel like I want to do these things, this is sort of my gut reaction, I know that I shouldn't. And so I'm not going to allow myself to act on these more negative impulses because I don't want to become the very person who is forcing me now to unlearn a lot of these negative behaviors. So my experience in these moments was a bit of numbness. This is sort of the in-between, right, that I'm talking about, where I've recognized the negative behaviors, I've traced them back, and I know where they're coming from. But in the moment, I still don't feel like I'm far enough along to embody those healthier behaviors. And so what did I do in those moments? I didn't really feel much towards the situation. And that was incredibly scary when I first started to encounter it. Because what happens when you grow up in an environment where you are told, who you are, who you should be, the emotions that you should have, the opinions that you should share, There's so much about you that is informed by another person that when you finally remove yourself from that environment, while it can be incredibly freeing, it's also very overwhelming because you're left feeling like, who am I? How do I feel about anything? And you don't really know the answers to those questions because you haven't been in an environment for long enough to experience those things and to answer them for yourself. And so now for me, I'm at this point where all I know is what I don't want to do, is the kind of person that I don't want to be. And so that is kind of step one for me. I'm not allowing myself to feel these more negative behaviors. I am not going to act on these impulses. But that also doesn't mean that I'm coming forward and I'm saying, okay, hey, I'm going to communicate directly. This is how I'm feeling, right? Let's resolve this. I'm sorry for my part in it. I take responsibility and I'm over it now. So if you feel good, we can move on. It's not so simple. So there was, I would say, probably a decent 6-month period-ish where I would encounter these situations and I would be stuck feeling nothing towards the situation. Previously, I would have felt something negative. I would have reacted in a way that now I'm not proud of. But in the moment, I couldn't yet bring myself to really feel those positive things. And so I wouldn't allow myself, or I guess I just didn't feel anything towards the situation. And it happened a number of different times. I mean, when you're raised by a narcissistic parent and now you're an adult, you understand how that kind of trauma really seeps into every aspect of your life and decision-making and relationships. It's sort of a non-stop process of unlearning and relearning. And so I would encounter these situations and I remember feeling really sad and really scared, sort of directionless, almost like I was broken. I felt like I had felt so much and so much of it was negative that I just wasn't capable of feeling anything anymore. And I also didn't have a firm grasp on who I was at the time. I was still very much in the early stages of searching for that identity, that self-trust, that sense of self at a very basic sort of fundamental level. And so when you're dealing with unlearning pretty much everything that you've ever been shown or been taught about behavior and relationships and interactions between people, in addition to feeling like you really don't have a solid foundation on who you are as a person, even on the things that you like or dislike, whether it's TV shows, movies, or what you want to eat for dinner, it leaves you feeling like there's just really nothing there. And again, part of the reason that I wanted to talk about this is because it's this really strange in-between phase that I haven't seen anyone talk about or write about. But it's so heavy, and I can't imagine that I'm the only one who's kind of come to that crossroads, where you have to make a decision to be a better person and to sit with a lot of that discomfort and that fear, to just let go, completely surrender everything that you've ever known in the hope of becoming a much better person on the other side of it all. And so for those 6 months, I was struggling a bit when I would encounter those situations that kind of brought to the surface these emotions and reactions from my past that still felt very real to me, very true to what I thought in the moment, who I was as a person, because it was something maybe that I had believed for so long that even the idea of letting that go felt impossible at times. But then, and this is when things start to take a turn for the positive, you get to a point where okay, you encounter a situation, maybe again, to use the same example, you get into a disagreement with your partner and you've got that self-awareness, you've been putting that into practice, right? Where you can now understand what happened, what kind of emotion that triggered in you and why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. You've practiced a bit of direct communication, and so now you can talk to your partner about it. And so maybe now in the moment, for the first time, you feel ready. You feel a little comfortable and you can say, okay, hey, when you said or did this thing, that made me kind of upset. And here's the reason for it. And this is how I'm feeling right now. But it's okay. We can talk it out and we'll work through it together. And you will genuinely mean it. And that is probably one of the most rewarding parts of the healing journey as a whole, is when you start to encounter these experiences or situations that at one point were so challenging and overwhelming that it felt impossible. For the thought of you ever encountering something like this and actually being able to handle it the way that you want to handle it seemed so far off in the future, like it might not ever happen. But there comes a time when you're ready, whether you've gained enough perspective, you've developed the emotional maturity or the tools to actually handle this situation in a way that you're proud of, right? You're in that moment now and you can think to yourself, okay, one, how do I want to handle this? That will allow me to kind of take a step in the direction of the kind of person that I want to be. And that applies, I think, for you and also for your partner or a friend, if there's another person involved in this situation, right? That's kind of two. That's the second part of this. Who do I want to be myself, and who do I want to be to the other people in my life that I care about? And one of the ways that you become that person for other people is through your reactions to things that they tell you or things that you experience with them that are maybe a little more stressful or more challenging. And so now you're in this moment and all of a sudden you're like, I'm actually going to put this healthy behavior into practice because I feel like I'm ready. And then you do it and it feels pretty good. And then the experience, if it's a disagreement, it comes and goes, you handle it, and that's that. It's much calmer, it's much easier, and at the end of the day, you're actually proud of your part in this. You're proud of the way that you handled it. And what that does, in my experience anyway, it makes it that much easier to implement that same healthy behavior the next time you encounter a similar situation. It's practice, right? And when we think about practice as a whole, right? Think about it in sports, in arts, anything creative. Every single medium, every kind of person practices. That's how they become better at something, through repetition, through trial and error. And I think it's so common for people who practice, who are working towards achieving something. Every time you show up at a practice and you do that one thing a little bit better, right? Maybe you shaved a second off your time. Maybe you didn't make an error at all practice, right? You kind of take these small little baby steps that motivate you to show up to practice, maybe even a little bit earlier next time, right? Because you can feel like you're making progress. And that, like I said, is when these things start to take a really positive turn, when it's like, okay, not only do I feel capable, right, to handle this same situation when it comes around next time, because it's life. Challenges, stressful situations are inevitable. They're going to happen. You will encounter them. All that you can control is how you react to them. And so now, not only do you feel capable, but you're ready and you're comfortable. It's no longer something to fear because you've achieved that stability, I want to say, that emotional intelligence and maturity, where now, regardless of the situation that you're faced with, right, you can sort of stop in the moment and ask yourself, okay, what's the right way to react to this? And then execute that. And it's so wonderful. I feel like it's such a moment or moments to be proud of, especially when you were raised in an environment that was so toxic, witnessing only unhealthy behavior, to now come out of that and to feel like, because of the amount of time and energy that you've put into healing, because of all the things that you've learned about your behavior, you probably have more of an awareness of your own behavior and reactions than the average person because of how much you've been thinking about it. Now you can be sort of a shining example of what to do in those moments for yourself and for other people. And that's an incredible transition. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't going to slip up, right? Because certain situations are maybe just a little bit more triggering than others. And that's happened to me also. Even once I reached this point where I was like, okay, I feel good about this. You know what I mean? Like, this feels true to me. This is the kind of person that I am. This is who I am. This is the kind of person that I want to be. This is how I want to handle myself moving forward. Even after I felt confident in that part of myself, there are still times when I encounter a really stressful or challenging situation that triggers something maybe a little deeper rooted in me, and maybe I'm already starting to feel a little bit irritable, maybe things didn't go my way that day. It's kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, let's say, right? And sometimes you resort back to the behavior that feels all too familiar. And that's okay, so long as you realize what just happened, right? You can't fault yourself for your reactions, but what you can do is take responsibility for them. And that in and of itself is a huge part of the healing journey, is learning to be comfortable with taking responsibility, with holding yourself accountable for a more negative part of an interaction, and understanding that it's okay to forgive yourself and moving forward to kind of use that as motivation. It's sort of a reminder. I remember in those instances with me where, I called it a relapse of bad behavior when I wrote about it in my journal. And it kind of motivated me to not do that even more, because now I'm in this healthier headspace, right? I've had practice with these healthier behaviors, that when these unhealthy behaviors are brought to the surface and I just act on them without really thinking, I'm reminded of how bad that feels, and I'm reminded of how much more difficult it is to reconcile a situation when I'm not in an emotionally mature state of mind, if that makes sense. And so it does happen, but it's okay, as long as you don't continue to let it happen. And so there is this really bright light at the end of the tunnel of this numbness, this really uncomfortable, directionless, in-between sort of period. And I wanted to emphasize how great it feels when you actually do get there, to kind of motivate anyone who's in that right now to keep going and to be patient with yourself. I had no idea that I was in this sort of weird in-between period until afterwards. And I guess my hope in talking about this is making it easier for people who are in the thick of it, who maybe don't entirely understand that right now you're not allowing yourself to perpetuate toxicity or negativity, the same behavior that you grew up witnessing, sometimes even being called upon to put into practice. And that's a really great thing. But especially when you add in the idea that so often being in a new environment or allowing space for perspective comes from breaking out of a narcissistic relationship, whether that's removing yourself from a home environment, making the decision to go low or no contact, moving away. There's a lot already in losing those relationships that comes into play, where it's like, okay, you've got this relationship that was really prominent in your life, healthy or unhealthy, for an extended period of time that now looks completely different. And so that's already a massive change, sort of a massive transition that you're dealing with. And then, right, with this perspective, with this new environment, you are in a space, maybe for the first time as an adult or in your late teens, where you're able to ask yourself, who am I? What do I like? What's my opinion on this subject? And not feel judged. You're not pressured or swayed in one direction or another. And so you're developing a sense of identity for the first time. So there's a number of massive changes that are taking place in your life sort of simultaneously, at least within a very small chunk of time, which can be so overwhelming to be dealing with all of that while also feeling like you have no idea who you are. And there are good days when it's like, wow, I kind of have a blank slate. This is so freeing. I can say and do and feel and try anything that I want. But then there are also other days when maybe you're not feeling on top of the world and you want to rely on that foundation, on that sense of self, on your gut instinct to just know who you are and how you feel, but you don't yet have that. And so that is when it can feel really overwhelming. And I think that's why it's so important to be patient with yourself throughout this process, because there's a lot going on all at once. I hope by talking about this, I've emphasized enough what's on the other side. And there's no real time frame or timeline for how long this sort of in-between period might last. Like I said, I don't even think there's a solid conclusion on this more negative behavior. I think relapsing this bad behavior is something that's inevitable. It's something that's going to happen, but it's okay. understand what you're going through, all of the changes, all of the transitions. It makes sense why you might feel numb and completely directionless and overwhelmed. And in those moments when you're not allowing yourself to act on those more negative impulses, to implement that unhealthy behavior, understand that you're doing a really positive thing, that it might feel incredibly uncomfortable and scary and dark in the moment, but there will be a positive outcome, because the first step in implementing healthy behavior after recognizing the unhealthy behavior is not allowing yourself to perpetuate it. So that, I think, is what goes hand in hand with this in-between period, is a lot of restraint, which takes a lot of strength. And I think that kind of feeds into that numbness, is you're dedicating so much energy, right? So much of your mental energy to not allowing yourself to do this thing that you really want to do, that you feel justified in, right? That comes so naturally to you that you don't really have anything left over to put towards this positive stuff. And so the best thing that you can do is just kind of stay neutral, stay in this really sort of numb middle ground until you've encountered those experiences enough and you've done enough of the work where you get to a point where you feel ready to try. You feel ready to try to embody that better, healthier, emotionally mature version of yourself. And it may not always work the first time around, where you try to implement these healthy behaviors, but maybe it doesn't go as planned. It doesn't feel very good. And that's okay, as long as you keep trying, because there will come a time when you are actually ready. And when you implement those healthy behaviors and there's a really positive outcome, and it shows you kind of show yourself that it's possible. Not only is it possible, but when you're ready in that moment, it's going to feel kind of good. And I hope that when you reach that moment, you take a minute to kind of pat yourself on the back and recognize just how far you've come and how much you have learned and taught yourself on your own, in spite of the very people who were unwilling or incapable of doing that work, not only for themselves, but also for you as their kid. There's so much freedom on the other side. And I think the reason for that is because when you grow up with emotionally reactive, volatile, performative parents or parent, every situation is completely unpredictable, because life is unpredictable. And what so many narcissistic parents lack is the emotional maturity to stabilize their reactions and their mental state. And I think you have fully, truly reached emotional peace, I would say, when you can control your reactions to any given situation. That, I think, is the epitome of mental peace and mental stability and mental maturity, is understanding that life is unpredictable. You cannot control what happens. The only thing that you can control is how you react to these things. And so growing up in an environment with an emotionally reactive parent, to then becoming your own young adult, or even later on in life, a full-blown adult who has achieved that mental peace, who feels self-aware and self-reflective enough to understand how you're feeling in the moment, and then ask yourself, how should I best respond? How should I respond to this situation so that it goes over the best, so that I can continue to be the kind of person that I want to be? What an accomplishment, truly. So I just want to applaud, I think, everyone who has made the decision to start healing, everyone who has dealt with that in-between period or is dealing with it. And I want to emphasize as much as I can how incredible that moment is when you finally feel ready to start becoming the person that you want to be, to start implementing those behaviors. You inspire yourself, and I think in turn, everyone around you. So, way to go. Way to go. I am proud of us all, and I'm really happy to talk about this topic. I hope that this is helpful, and I just think about how I might have benefited from this if I had heard someone talking about exactly this maybe a year and a half ago. So with that, I think I'll be wrapping up this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.